Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Owen Likes Comics. Today, I'm joined by a wonderful special guest. I am joined by writer, artist extraordinaire, Chip Zdarsky. Chip, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. Yourself?
I'm great. It's been a busy week. I've been reading a lot of Santa-themed comics this week.
Oh,
There are some bizarre stories in there. There's a Lobo Santa special from like the early 90s, which I read for the first time this week.
oh,
which
the paramilitary Santa special.
Yeah.
Oh my God,
I'd heard of it
good.
and I'd seen it, but I hadn't actually sat down and read it until about 2 days ago. And what a delight!
It's so good. It's like the high mark of comics, as far as I'm concerned.
It really is.
Yeah.
It is so much fun. So my week's going well. In the grand scheme of things, I can't complain. And obviously, we're going to have a conversation. Mostly, we're going to talk about my background is slightly blurred, so I hope this still stays in shot. We're going to have a conversation about public domain.
I like it just blurs out my name. Like it makes it seem really sordid. I love it.
It's almost like I planned that.
Yeah.
But we're going to have a conversation about public domain because that's a topic that I'm really interested in. I think it's a great series, and it opens up to a really interesting conversation about the kind of history of the comics industry and creator rights and those sorts of conversations. So this book's brilliant. I've been a fan of your work since Sex Criminals first came out.
Oh wow, thanks.
That was a book that was one of my first forays into like regularly reading indie books.
Oh, nice.
It was definitely one of the first image series I picked up, and it was how I discovered both you and Matt, who have become kind of long-standing favorites of mine. And then kind of seeing your transition from writer to artist, everything from kind of Howard the Duck, Spider-Man Life Story, and now so you've always been a writer that I've always kind of looked to and admired. And if you've got a new book out, it's always like, this is someone that normally works for me. I'll check them out. And so obviously I was quite intrigued by the concept of public domain. It's an entirely creator-owned book. It was originally funded through Substack. It's you writing and drawing. It's a kind of one-man show. And it's about the kind of things that I'm particularly fascinated by, which is kind of the history of the comic book industry and kind of some of the dirty behind-the-scenes stuff. And I waited until it was kind of collected as a trade because I thought that this would be a story that I want to kind of read in one sitting. So I picked up the trade over a year ago, read it in an afternoon, and by the time it finished, I was crying like a baby. So I'll have to invoice you for that.
Oh God.
I'll send that over after we finish recording.
All right.
But I thought it was a really brilliant series, and I found it really powerful. And obviously, I shouldn't talk about it in the past tense. It is still ongoing, and there's a kind of new slew of issues coming out. But I mostly wanted to frame the conversation around the first arc and the first kind of 5 or 6 issues. Okay. If that's okay with you.
Yeah, of course.
Obviously, this is a book that pulls on a lot of real life history in the comics industry, and also seems to pull from a lot of your own personal feelings and experiences. We can dive into that more specifically in a second, but I was first intrigued about hearing where kind of the initial idea and concepts of public domain originated from.
Yeah, so I do a podcast with some friends called Manga-splaining. And that started when all of us went to Tokyo for a trip, a comics-themed trip. I was a guest at one of the comic conventions there. And the rest of my friends, they're big into manga. They work in the industry. And so we were going to a lot of like manga museums, manga shops, pilgrimages to towns where famous manga creators were from. And like the whole time, I'm just like, what is this? Like we went to a full museum dedicated to a bug man who rides a motorbike, like Kamen Rider. I'm just like, what is this? This is wild. You know, I'd read a bit of manga before, but not enough to really kind of understand what I was experiencing. So during that trip, I kind of put forth the idea that they should educate me on manga, and we'll call it Manga-splaining. So basically, since 2019, we've been on and off, but for the most part, reading a manga series every week, usually a volume or two that they suggest, and then we talk about it. So at this point, I've read hundreds of manga books, and I'm no longer the newbie, but I'm still learning. And so what part of the process, I noticed that in the Japanese comic industry, there's a wider breadth of books, and they're not as concerned with genre, or at least the genres become very hyper specific
Yeah.
in weird ways. And so it seemed to me that a lot of the manga creators were just kind of figuring out what they loved in life and then doing manga about it, whether it's about making rice or about business deals, or if it's about ping pong, or about radio DJs, like, well, whatever it is, like there's a focus there, which creates a lot of interesting kind of stories. North American comics, it tends to be like, well, it's a cowboy meets sci-fi. It's a zombie meets a vampire. It's a superhero meets medieval times. Like whatever it is, it's always just like smashing things together for the most part, which is, I'm guilty of it as well, but it is a little boring. So that really got me thinking, like, okay, well, what's my passion? What's the thing that I love the most that I want to do a story about? And it was the saddest day of my life when I realized it was comics. Like, I work in comics, and my only interest is in comics, in the history of it, how they're made. It's funny, like all my friends have hobbies, like either collecting vinyl or synthesizers or whatever. And mine is just comics, which is, it is what it is. And so I realized at that moment, okay, my next series is probably just going to be about comics, but not a superhero book. It'd be a book about the people making it. So that was kind of the origin of it. And at that time, I was doing my newsletter on Substack already, but then Substack offered a bunch of creators basically a grant to produce comics there. So it just kind of made sense that that would be where I came back to drawing again, because I'd drawn all of Sex Criminals, and at the end of that I was like, oh, I don't want to do that again. Like that's a bit of a trial. And so with the Substack deal, I was like, oh, okay, this is actually the moment, and this is the thing that I'm passionate about. So yeah, let's do it. And the Substack deal is such that we own everything we make, so it kind of fit thematically to kind of produce it that way.
We've kind of danced around what the subject nature of the book is, in which it's a fictional story that is very much about the real history of comics. It is about a kind of retired comic book artist who many decades ago co-created a character and basically kind of got screwed out of the rightful credit and royalties for those characters. And the book is kind of mostly about the present day experience of him and his two sons fighting to regain control of the character and kind of bring the comic book back as a kind of family endeavor, which is what kind of the ongoing issues that are coming out currently is more focused on, which are incredible, by the way. I'm loving the series.
Oh, thanks.
And obviously with that, there's a lot of parallels in kind of the character of Sid Dallas, the artist, too. Yeah. I remember when I was reading the book for the first time, the bit where the main protagonist, the journalist, goes into the basement and sees his dad's kind of work desk and has like a flashback to when he was a kid. Mm-hmm. And it's drawn to look exactly like Jack Kirby's dungeon. And I remember that was the moment where it all clicks, and it was like, no, this is a book that's going to hit me really hard, because I'm such a big fan of Kirby and know a lot about the kind of goings on in his personal life, in his history. Yeah. But it's also a parallel to people like Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster, Bill Finger, Steve Ditko. Unfortunately, we could list 100 names of incredible creators that didn't necessarily get what they deserved and spent many years of their life after they'd created certain characters fighting for credit, for royalties, residuals, or just for a kind of recognition. Yeah. With that, obviously, it seems like quite an intentional choice to draw upon some of those stories and parallels in your story. What was the process like of doing that, and kind of what research did you conduct into those kind of real life stories?
Well, like I said, it was already kind of an interest of mine, so the research had, in a very large sense, already kind of been done. I read Sean Howe's Marvel book, which is like one of my favorite books. It's
Sean's a friend of the show, and that book was like, reading that for the first time was one of the things that made me realize that I could do this for a living.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. And like one of the things when I finished that book, I was just like, oh, I need the updated version in like 10, 15 years. Because towards the end of the book, it's like people start talking nice a bit more because they're still currently working. And I kind of want those stories when people are telling the truth. So, so that book, 10 Cent Plague was another one that I really loved. Miller Eisner, which is really interesting as well, which is just like a transcript of a conversation between Frank Miller and Will Eisner.
I've been meaning to read that for ages.
Yeah,
Because I've read
great.
Tencent Plague at the start of this year and loved that. Because the Comics Code is another like weird fascination of mine. And David Hadju did an incredible job kind of chronicling that. But Miller Eisner has been something that's like, I need to find the time to actually sit and read this because this is going to be really fascinating.
Yeah, no, it really is. It's, most of it's kind of like process, but there's a bit of history stuff in there too. I really loved, was it the Modern Masters series that Tomorrow's Publishing did?
Yes.
Where they would focus on a different artist and basically interview them and kind of go through their career. The fascinating part with that, I found, was so many of the artists were just like, the questions would be longer than the answers. Like the question would be like, oh, what did it mean when you did this and blah, blah, blah. And like, it's a job. The answers are, it's a job. And I really respect that. And I think a lot of that kind of made its way into public domain. Just in terms of, in the main character, Sid Dallas, like it was a job. He sat down, he did the work, he put food on the table, and it wasn't a thing that wasn't a true passion, but it was like he was invested in it and he did it, and he retired and he's okay. Like I really wanted to make sure it wasn't a sad sack story.
No, like when you meet the character in the book, the kind of first issue, he is very content and happy with his life.
Yeah,
he's happily retired. He's married. He's settled.
Yeah,
and it's more kind of the adventure and the main kind of drive of the story more comes from his sons.
Yeah, 100%, and eventually from his wife.
Yeah,
he basically is like, you created this thing, like.
But I think it's important then to like. But I do think it's important now, you say, to not kind of frame Sid from the impetus as kind of a sob story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I mean, the book is about creating characters and ownership and that kind of fight. But I always knew that was just going to be the launch pad for the family story about those characters and about eventually when they start kind of making comics together and what that process is like, and about adapting to the modern world. Like there are other things that kind of spring from it. So I didn't really want it to be too much of like a hammer on the head, like creators get ripped off and it's bad and we need to fight and stop that. Like we know that, but there's a lot of kind of gray areas in there as well, which I think are more interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as well, like as much as I think it does pull from a lot of kind of real history, it also seems in a lot of ways quite autobiographical for you as well, as someone that worked as a journalist and a reporter for several years, then kind of broke through with books like Sex Criminals and through the kind of indie comics world.
Yeah.
And now to kind of come back to that after you've been writing Batman, you've done Spider-Man, you've done a lot of all the big characters. Now to kind of come back to the world of create your own comic and tell what seems to me like quite a personal story. Would you describe it as such yourself?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd take issue with is like I've been doing tons of creator-owned stuff.
No, of course.
Because Sex Criminals was my first big project.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very lucky that it was a big success. And so I knew immediately, like right out of the gate, what it meant to create a thing and to own it. Because when those first checks came in from Image, I was just like, oh, okay, all the money goes to us.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Because I was friends with a lot of like Marvel writers and DC writers at the time. Like, I'm good friends with Ed Brubaker.
Mm-hmm.
He obviously had his things with Winter Soldier.
Of course.
But the fact that this was Sex Criminals was my first big gig, and I could see that this is the thing that's going to pay me for the rest of my life. That was a big moment. And so there hasn't been a period in the past 10 years since that moment where I haven't had a creator-owned book going.
Yeah. But I mean in the scope of kind of telling a story like Public Domain, which is about ownership of comics and about the process of creating comics and having kind of control and ownership of it and authorship of it yourself, that seems quite personal in the scope of kind of where you started as well.
Yeah, for sure. And like it was also part of the reason why I wanted to do it all myself. Like, I draw it, I write it, I letter it poorly, I color it, and I design it. it's my project. It's a novel. It's not just like a comic. It's yeah, it's personal, but it also doesn't necessarily reflect my journey because I didn't have to go through any of that.
Yeah.
Like I've witnessed it and I've read a lot about it, but my experience with Marvel and DC is very different than the people who have come before me. And again, I think a lot of that has to do with sex criminals. You know, this is the thing I've said before, which is like maybe not as true now as when I started, but when I was starting off doing a few Marvel books and still drawing sex criminals, I would tell people sex criminals pays for my house, Marvel pays for my groceries. Like, it was the difference in terms of like payment, the difference in terms of investment in yourself. And so yeah, so I've never gone through the experience that like Sid, Dallas, or Miles, or David in the book have gone through. I've witnessed it. But I have a very different experience with those companies and other people.
But obviously, like, even if you've not experienced those things directly, you still exist in a kind of ecosystem where you're aware that those things have historically happened and still do continue to happen. So even if it's not things that that's happened to you, you can still comment and discuss them as someone that kind of works in this ecosystem.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And the kind of world around you.
Yeah. Like I said, I've been friends with people who have had grievances with these companies, so I've heard from them. I've witnessed them kind of spiral as a result of it, and yeah, like you can't not know the history of this stuff, especially once these characters ended up on the big screen. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, now it's really apparent how valuable these characters are.
Absolutely. And then as well, kind of like you said, with it being a project that's all you know, you write this, you draw it, you letter this, you color this. It is a complete one-man show. And not only I think that's part of the strength of the series, is that kind of in every corner and every page and in every nook and cranny, you can feel your creative voice and sensibilities in the story. But it also kind of makes it adds to the idea of that this is a creator-owned book about the joy and the importance of creator-owned books.
Yeah.
I think not that it wouldn't be a good series if there was other people kind of doing the penciling and the inking and the coloring, but the fact that it is a kind of one-man endeavor in that sense, I think adds thematically quite nicely.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like all my other books have been with co-creators, and it's not creator-owned; it's creators-owned.
Yeah,
which is actually a very different thing, because you do have to negotiate with other people a lot. And work out deals, and there's legalities, and there's profit sharing, and like who makes the decisions when it comes to, you know, selling things.
So are you saying that this was just a way to stop sharing money with Matt Fraction then?
Yeah, exactly. That tyrant. But you know, even like, I mean, Matt and we're best friends, and that experience like brought us closer together, and it was amazing. But there were definitely periods, especially when you bring in other people like agents or lawyers and stuff, where it's like, oh, okay, I'm mad at somebody right now. Like,
no, of course, it's
and then so that kind of, it's never quite as, I mean, you've seen it with like The Walking Dead, you know, Robert Kirkman and Tony Moore, like there are like lawsuits and stuff there. Like, just because it's creator owned doesn't mean it's not necessarily going to be easy or not contentious.
Kind of the word creator owned has this kind of very idyllic idea behind it, but it can get very messy. You know, mixing friends and business can be quite troublesome at times, even in the best of circumstances.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a ticking time bomb within public domain as a result of that, which is Sid Dallas. I'll spoil the end of the first trade. Like, he ends up realizing he's got full ownership over the character. So great, he can go off and make his comics and stuff. It's a nice family thing. But even though the writer who still works at the comic company, Jerry, is a dick, shouldn't he own part of that? Like, so there's that element.
And then even into kind of what's been going on in the more recent issues, where, you know, Sid is having to kind of take a step back and hand off the book to other people while still having ownership of it. Kind of his creative ideas aren't necessarily what's making it into the stories.
Yeah, exactly. It's comics are really fascinating because, you know, when you lean kind of more kind of indie, alternative or whatever, they're mostly singular visions. but once you kind of hit the Image, Marvel, DC, Oni, Boom, whatever, whether the creator owned or not, it's a team, a small team, but it's still a team, and that's there are problems that arise from that for sure.
Absolutely. So with that as well, obviously, Public Domain has come back this year with a new run of issues, and alongside that, we've also got the release of its sister series, The Domain, which is kind of like the in-universe comic book that the characters you're reading in Public Domain are creating. And that was such a brilliant companion series to the main book, one that I didn't know I needed, but adds so much to the reading experience.
Cool.
What was the process? How long into the process of kind of coming up with Public Domain did you have this idea to also create this book to go alongside it?
I knew I wanted to do it like almost right away. Like as soon as I started to plan on Public Domain, I was just like, oh, okay, then they make this comic. Like, well, if they make the comic, I also make the comic. And it was a toss-up between kind of doing that and doing like kind of old Domain adventures, like ones that the original team had made.
Kind of take what they did in, I think Paul Jenkins did that in his Sentry series in 2000, where there's like the backups are like the old Sentry stories from the Silver Age that obviously he and Jay Lee and co had to come up with there and then.
Alex Segura doing something similar as well with the Lynx, the character from his novels. There's a fun meta quality to that, but yeah, I really wanted to make sure that, because it adds another level to the story as well, in terms of seeing the process in Public Domain and the fights, and then seeing what it results in on the page, and that it's more modern than what Sid would have done on his own. So yeah, I knew I wanted to do it right from the start, and then I just had to kind of bite the bullet, because I also know, and this is the weird, I'm in a privileged position where I can put out a book that does not make money and I will be okay. You know, Batman has helped, Sex Criminals has helped, make sure that I can pay my mortgage. And so yeah, when I decided to kind of pull the trigger on it, I knew Rachel Stott would be the person for it, because I'd worked with her before and she's just so delightful. She's an artist who does modern, highly detailed, kind of oriented, but also very cartoony. Like it just still feels very comic.
Absolutely. Rachel feels like such a perfect voice for that story in that series. And I was going to ask what the process was like of identifying someone to kind of work on it with.
I mean, it was her kind of right from the start. I'd worked with her on Sex Criminals. We did a one shot with her, and she was great. And I did a small Marvel thing with her, and it just made a lot of sense to have her on board. And I knew I shouldn't draw it, because I'd be drawing it in my style, which would be
you want it to have a different feel, and also like from a workload perspective, you can only do so much. Yeah,
and also it's I recognize it as a little weird, because the characters in the comic that's being created look far more realistic than the characters who are creating them. So, because I can't do realistic drawings, so you have to kind of shut your brain off a little bit for that. But yeah, I really wanted to see that comic exist, and I'm fortunate enough to have the ability to kind of will that into reality, which has been really nice.
No, it is, and it's such a great companion series to the main story. And I like I said, it feels silly now that it never existed alongside it. That there was the entire first 6 issues where it wasn't there. Is the idea that as Public Domain continues, the Domain will also run alongside it for the foreseeable?
Look, while I'm okay with losing money, I can't lose that much money. No, the 5 issues is it. Like I wanted.
No, we're not going to get 100 issues of the Domain.
No, unless I strike some giant Hollywood deal in which it makes a lot of sense to keep doing it. No,
Look,
5 issues.
I'm sure it'll be a Disney Plus series by the end of next year.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, that's exactly what they want. No, the 5 issues felt kind of perfect. It was my first time really doing like a straight up superhero origin story. You know, I'd worked at Marvel and DC, but you're inheriting characters, and like you're not necessarily doing that kind of classic take.
You're not really inventing protagonists of books.
No. So it's very much like a mix of Fantastic Four, Green Lantern kind of origin story. But yeah, just a ton of fun. Yeah, I mean, if you're making comics, you should be having fun.
Yeah, and so kind of wrapping up this section talking about public domain, I wanted to touch on a little bit about what the process has been like of doing this book through Substack.
Yeah.
Because I remember when Substack kind of made its big foray into comics and thinking it was a really interesting situation.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'd been subscribed to Substack for several years just as kind of fans of newsletters. I think what you're doing over there is great.
Cool.
I love what Grant Morrison is doing with Xanadu. It's just the weirdest things in my inbox every week, and I love it so much. But then to see it make the jump to do, no, we are going to finance and we are actually going to publish new comic stories with big name writers was so exciting.
Yeah.
And to see kind of like such a tremendous book like this come out of it, I think is a real testament to that model and to that approach. What has the process been like to you? Obviously, having worked with lots of different publishers, what's it been like to kind of do the book with Substack, and then also to kind of distribute it and publish it through Image as well?
The Substack deal was so positive, and with no strings attached. That it was basically like, we just need you to do a couple of posts a week, and we'll pay you this much money, and you own it all, and that's it, no pressure. Like, I was like, oh, okay, like. It was definitely a situation where you could just take the money and run if you wanted. You could just do a couple of posts a week, just like, hey, just me checking in, boom, and that's it, and not make any comics. Like, there's nothing in the contract that said you have to make comics, which is wild. But it gave me the one thing I missed about doing. I used to do web comics back in the day, and the one thing I missed was that the impetus to do it regularly. Like, I had to have pages done and posted every week.
Yeah.
So it gave me those short deadlines, because like on comics you have a longer deadline, you have a month. I think a lot of comic artists kind of blow through that first couple of weeks dicking around, and then they dig in.
It's so funny you mentioned kind of the webcomics approach, and I don't want to bring him up again because I know it's a touchy subject, but when I spoke with Ryan, one thing we were talking about in regards to how he's managed with Fantastic Four, which obviously is a lot of kind of weird one-shot sci-fi stories, is his background in things like dinosaur comics, and how that's kind of trained his brain to work in a very particular way, which has now lended itself really well to that. So it's interesting to hear you talk about how webcomics has also kind of given you that mindset when it comes to deadlines and plotting out stories and having the creative drive to do these things, even when you've not got someone breathing down your neck telling you to get your pages in.
Yeah, I mean, beyond that, also, my training was at a newspaper. And so those were daily deadlines. Like, you'd get your assignment at 2 p.m. It has to be ready for press at 6. And so it was like, comics felt like a breeze after that. That definitely helped a lot. But yeah, so that Substack model of kind of feeling like, oh, especially when people are paying for it, like, it's like, okay, you have to provide them this content every week, every couple of weeks. So that helped a lot in terms of building it up, because otherwise, I think if I signed up to do it at Image right out of the gate, it would have taken me years to get like that first issue done, amidst all the other work I was doing. So yeah, the Substack thing worked out really well for me, and I think a lot of people enjoyed it. It also enabled me to bring back one of my other creator-owned series, Kaptara, which I was doing with Kagan McLeod, which we kind of left hanging because we basically ran out of money. And now suddenly we had money. It's like, oh, I can pay Kagan and we could finish this. Yeah, because sometimes you just want the art to be out in the world, even if it's not necessarily a huge success, right?
Yeah, there's kind of, like you said earlier, when you were talking about things that pay the mortgage and things that pay for groceries, there is the part of you, and it's similar to the work I do, where it's like, I'm making this because I need to pay my bills. And I know that this is something that will do well enough that I can do that. But then there's also something to be said about creating art and creating things just because of passion and because you want to tell those stories.
Yeah. You kind of have to have the balance, or else you'll lose your mind. Like you understand, like once in a while you have to do a video where the video thumbnail will be you doing this.
Yeah, sometimes you got to put boobs in the thumbnail.
Sometimes you got to.
It's what I call the quarterly Batman video.
Yeah.
So it's like, I'll do something really out there, and it's like, I don't know if people are going to be interested in this.
Yeah.
And then straight after that, I'd be like, here's a video on death in the family. Or
yeah, exactly.
You know, it's the Joker dressed up. It's kind of the Ayatollah in the thumbnail. And it's like,
that'll do it. And there's a reason Scott Snyder came back and did Absolute Batman. Like, he loves the character, but also it's like, oh, this lifts all boats.
Yes.
Like, his distillery books will do better if he's doing Batman as well. I think any creative industry you're in, when there's a commercial aspect to it, and you don't have like a trust fund or something like that. Like you got to balance it
No,
out.
of course, it is kind of like a one for you, one for me approach, but it's hard to sometimes not to get lost in just doing the work that's going to make the money and still having that creative outlet.
Yeah, and it can't be one for them, one for me. It's got to be all for you, but there's variations there.
Of course.
Like you have to still kind of enjoy making those Batman videos, obviously.
Yeah, and obviously writing Batman comics.
Yeah, exactly.
Chip, I won't take up too much more of your time. I really
no
appreciate
worries.
you joining me for this conversation, Chip. Why don't you let everyone know where people can find you and specific things they should be buying and reading and keeping up with?
Look, you can find me at Zdarsky.substack.com, but really you should be finding me in comic shops with Zdarsky Comic News, which every shop should be ordering. It's all the news that you need in life, I think.
There's a great installment in the latest one about who should write Batman. You've got the inside track on all of the possible contenders.
That's true.
I picked it up in my comic shop last week and audibly cackled in the shop reading the thing you wrote about James Tynion.
Perfect.
So funny.
Yeah, I mean, like it's a dumb venture. Like I'm basically, selling these out to shops to give away to the people, and they're 4 to 8 pages depending on if I get ads or not. And yeah, I love making them.
They're really great. We talked about a little bit off mic earlier that like Wizard Magazine is one of my like weird special interests and fascinations.
Yeah.
So reading what you've been doing with ZCN feels like a modern day equivalent to something like Old Wizard. So I'm picking them up. I believe my comic shops because there's kind of 2 near where I live. So just depending on which way I fancy walking when I leave the house, I can go to either. So I bullied them both into stocking them now, and we'll be continuing to move further afield. And then obviously Substack.
Yeah.
And if you want to meet Chip, come to Toronto on December 14th, Comics Con 24. If you want to buy all of his stuff and ship it to me, that works too. We can set something up.
Perfect.
Right. Thank you so much, Chip.
All right. Thanks, Owen.
Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are about this interview. And until next time, take care.